The gravel crunched under worn boots as Jake Mercer stood at the edge of what used to be his grandfather's property. 43 years old, honorably discharged 3 months ago, and already he felt like a ghost haunting his own life. The farmhouse still stood barely, its white paint peeling like sunburned skin. But the barn, the massive red structure that had dominated his childhood summers, was nothing but a black skeleton against the Missouri sky. Ranger, his Belgian Malinois, pressed against his leg. The dog had been with him through 2 tours in Afghanistan, had pulled him from a burning Humvee in Kandahar, had laid beside him through the screaming nights that followed. Now they were both just trying to figure out what came next. The fire had happened 6 weeks ago, according to the lawyer's letter. Lightning strike, the local fire department said. Jake hadn't come back for the funeral 2 years prior, when his grandfather finally gave up the fight against lung cancer. Hadn't come back for much of anything since he enlisted at 18, running from ghosts of a different kind. He walked toward the ruins, Ranger trotting ahead, nose to the ground. The dog had that focus, that intensity that never quite left, even in civilian life. Jake understood. Some things you couldn't just turn off because you crossed back over an invisible line on a map. The September sun was warm, but not punishing. Cicadas buzzed in the oak trees that ringed the property. This land had been in the Mercer family since 1889, homesteaded by his great-great-grandfather, who'd come west with nothing but a wagon and a dream. Now it would probably be sold to some developer who'd carve it into half-acre lots with names like Heritage Meadows or Settlers Point. Ranger stopped suddenly, ears forward, tail rigid. Jake's hand went instinctively to his hip, to where his sidearm used to be. Old habits. The dog moved forward into the collapsed barn, picking his way carefully through the charred timber and twisted metal. Jake followed, his therapist's voice in his head. Ground yourself when you feel it coming. Name 5 things you can see. Burned wood, melted farm equipment, Ranger's tan and black coat, blue sky through the skeleton of the roof. And there, where Ranger was digging, something else, something that didn't belong. The dog uncovered it within minutes, powerful paws sending up clouds of ash. A metal box, about the size of a shoebox, with a combination lock that had melted partially but still held. Jake knelt beside it, his knees protesting. The box was old, the kind his grandfather might have used to store important documents. But this wasn't in the house. This was buried in the barn, under what would have been the tack room. He tried to pry it open, but the lock held. Ranger sat, watching him with those intelligent brown eyes, waiting. Always waiting for the next command, the next mission. Good boy, Jake said, his voice rough from disuse. He picked up the box. It was heavy, substantive. Something was definitely inside, shifting slightly as he moved it. Back at his truck, an old Ford F-150 that had seen better decades, Jake found a crowbar in the toolbox. The lock gave way with a shriek of metal, and the box fell open. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, and a leather journal. But what caught his attention immediately was the newspaper clipping on top, yellowed and brittle. The headline read, "Local girl 16 vanishes without trace." The date was July 4th, 1985, 39 years ago. Jake's hands started to shake. He knew that date. He knew it because his grandfather had told him once, during one of their few heart-to-heart conversations, that July 4th, 1985 was the day everything changed. The day the town stopped trusting each other. The day the summer died. The girl in the photograph was pretty, with long dark hair and a smile that suggested she knew secrets. Her name, according to the article, was Sarah Brennan. She had disappeared from the town's Independence Day festival, last seen near the fairgrounds at dusk. No body had ever been found. No suspect had ever been charged. And his grandfather had kept a box of evidence hidden in his barn for nearly 4 decades. Jake sat in his truck for 20 minutes before he could bring himself to open the journal. Ranger had given up waiting and was sleeping in the passenger seat, paws twitching with whatever dreams military dogs had. Jake envied him that, the ability to sleep without the pills, without the nightmares. The journal was his grandfather's. Jake recognized the handwriting immediately, that careful script they'd taught in schools back when penmanship mattered. The first entry was dated July 5, 1985. I should have spoken up yesterday. At the festival I saw something. Earl Brennan's truck parked behind the equipment barn at the fairgrounds, around 8:30. Earl wasn't in it, but I saw someone else nearby. I didn't think much of it at the time. Earl's always been a hard man, especially since his wife left. Sarah's his only child, and he controls that girl like she's property. But now she's missing, and I can't shake the feeling I should have paid more attention. Jake's chest tightened. Earl Brennan. He knew that name. The old man still lived in town, must be in his 80s now, living in that dilapidated house on Sycamore Street. Jake had mowed his lawn once as a kid, had been terrified by the man's cold stare and harsh words. He flipped through the pages. His grandfather had documented everything, conversations he'd overheard, suspicious behavior, the official investigation that seemed to go nowhere. And then, 3 months after the disappearance, a name that made Jake's blood run cold. Sheriff Clayton asked me to come down to the station today, wanted to know why I was asking so many questions about Sarah Brennan, said some people were getting uncomfortable with my interest in the case. He told me, and these were his exact words, "Let sleeping dogs lie, George. The girl probably ran off to Kansas City or St. Louis, plenty of girls do." But I saw his eyes when he said it. He wasn't looking for the truth. He was looking to bury it. Sheriff Clayton, Jake's father's best friend, the man who used to bring him candy at Christmas and had given him his first beer at 15, the man who'd represented law and order in their small town for over 30 years before retiring. The journal entries became more desperate as the months passed. His grandfather had started his own investigation, careful and methodical. He'd discovered that Sarah had been planning to leave town, had been saving money from her job at the diner. She'd been seeing someone, though no one would say who, and she'd been afraid of her father. Then, in December of 1985, a chilling entry. Found something today, down by Miller's Creek, where the kids park. A piece of jewelry, caught in the roots of a willow tree. It's Sarah's locket. I gave it to her myself for her 16th birthday just 2 weeks before she disappeared. Had her initials engraved on it. But there's something else. Blood on the chain. Not much, but enough. The next page was torn out. So was the one after that. When the entries resumed, 3 weeks later, the handwriting was different. Shakier. Older somehow. They came to the farm last night. Didn't identify themselves, but I knew what they were. What they wanted. They made it clear that if I continued asking questions, if I went to the state police, there would be consequences. They didn't threaten me directly. They threatened Jake, my grandson, 6 years old. They knew his teacher's name, knew what time he got dropped off at school. The message was received. I'm putting this box in the barn under the tack room floor. If something happens to me, maybe someone will find it. Maybe someone will care enough to finish what I couldn't. Jake felt sick. His grandfather had protected him, had given up the search for justice to keep a 6-year-old boy safe, and he'd carried that secret for the rest of his life, letting it eat him alive from the inside. But why keep the evidence? Why not destroy it if he was really giving up? Because he hoped. George Mercer had been a Marine in Korea, had earned a Silver Star and 2 Purple Hearts. He didn't give up, not really. He just waited. Waited for a time when the threat had passed, when the powerful men who'd silenced him were dead or too old to matter. He'd waited for Jake to come home. The town of Ashford, Missouri hadn't changed much in 25 years. Same brick buildings on Main Street, same Dairy Queen on the corner, same church spires piercing the sky. Population 4,200, give or take, depending on whether the college kids from the community college counted as residents. Jake parked in front of the library, a Carnegie building from 1912 that smelled like old books and broken dreams. Ranger stayed in the truck, windows cracked, water, bowl full. The morning was cool enough and Jake wouldn't be long. Mrs. Henderson was still the head librarian, though she must have been pushing 80. She'd taught his Sunday school class once upon a time, before he'd stopped believing in much of anything. She looked up from her desk with eyes that had seen too many funerals and not enough weddings. "Jake Mercer," she said, and there was something in her voice. Not quite warmth, but not hostility either. Caution, maybe. "Heard you were back. Small towns. Information traveled faster than light." "Yes, ma'am, I need to look at some old newspapers from 1985. Her expression shifted. Now there was something else. Recognition, maybe even relief. "The microfilm is in the back room. I'll set you up." She didn't ask why. She didn't ask which articles. She just led him to a small room with a microfilm reader that probably belonged in a museum and left him alone with the past. Jake started with July 1985 and worked forward. The Sarah Brennan disappearance dominated the local coverage for weeks. She was the perfect victim for media attention. Young, pretty, from a respectable family. Her father gave tearful interviews. The sheriff promised a thorough investigation. The town rallied together, organizing search parties that combed the woods and fields for miles. But as his grandfather's journal had suggested, something was off. The investigation seemed to circle without ever landing. Leads that were mentioned once and never followed up. Witnesses whose statements contradicted each other but were never reconciled. And through it all, Earl Brennan's face, stoic and hard, revealing nothing. Jake found what he was looking for in the August 15th edition, a small article, buried on page 6. Sheriff Clayton addresses concerns about Brennan investigation. The article was brief, defensive. The sheriff insisted that every lead was being pursued, but that without evidence, the investigation had reached a natural impasse. He suggested that Sarah might have run away, that teenagers often did unpredictable things. What was interesting was what came 3 days later. Another small article. State police decline involvement in Brennan case. The state authorities had been petitioned by concerned citizens to take over the investigation. They'd reviewed the case file and determined that local law enforcement was handling the matter appropriately. No state involvement was necessary. Jake sat back. That was the moment. That was when the door had closed, when someone with power had made sure the truth stayed buried. He printed out the articles and moved to the newspaper archives from 1986. Nothing. A few mentions on the anniversary, hopeful pieces about leads that went nowhere. And then Sarah Brennan became a statistic, a cautionary tale mothers told their daughters, a ghost story kids whispered at sleepovers. But Jake found something else. In March of 1986, a small obituary for a man named Thomas Riley, age 4, died in a single-car accident on Route 44, survived by his parents and a sister. The name meant nothing to Jake, but something made him note it down. When he emerged from the archives, Mrs. Henderson was waiting with a manila folder. "Your grandfather was a good man," she said quietly. "One of the few who cared more about right than about fitting in." She handed him the folder. Inside were photocopies of more newspaper articles, but also handwritten notes, Mrs. Henderson's handwriting. "I did my own research back then," she explained. "I knew Sarah. She used to come here after school, did her homework in the reading room. Sweet girl, sad eyes. She told me once that she was saving money to go to college, that she wanted to be a teacher. Her father didn't approve. Said education was wasted on girls." "What happened to her?" Jake asked. "The truth? I think she died that night. I think someone killed her, probably someone she knew. And I think that someone had friends in high places who made sure the truth stayed buried." She paused. "Your grandfather thought so too. We used to talk about it before he stopped, before someone scared him off." "Sheriff Clayton?" among others. Your father was involved somehow too, though I never could figure out exactly how. He was Clayton's deputy back then. She looked at Jake with ancient, knowing eyes. Some secrets run deep in families, Jake. Sometimes coming home means digging them up even when it hurts. Jake left the library with more questions than answers. His father, dead 15 years from a heart attack at 49, had been part of this. The man who'd taught him to fish, who'd showed up drunk to his high school graduation, who'd died angry and alone. He sat in his truck, Ranger's head in his lap, and opened Mrs. Henderson's folder. The handwritten notes were observations, timelines, connections. She'd been building her own case file, parallel to his grandfather's. And there, at the bottom, a name circled 3 times Thomas Riley, Sarah's boyfriend. Died 8 months after her disappearance. Accident? Miller's Creek ran through the southeast corner of the county, a lazy ribbon of brown water that swelled in spring and shrank to a trickle by August. Jake had fished there as a kid, caught his first base under his grandfather's patient instruction. Now he was following a decades-old clue, looking for a willow tree that might not even exist anymore. Ranger bounded ahead, happy to be out of the truck, exploring the world with the enthusiasm that had never quite left him, despite everything they'd seen. The dog had saved Jake's life in more ways than the obvious, had given him something to care about when caring seemed impossible. The parking area his grandfather had mentioned was still there, more overgrown now, the kind of place teenagers still came to drink cheap beer and figure out who they were. Jake could see tire tracks in the mud, recent ones. Some things never changed. He walked along, the creek bank, looking for an old willow. There were several, their roots exposed by years of erosion, reaching into the water like arthritic fingers. Which one had held Sarah's locket? Ranger made the decision for him, trotting directly to a massive willow about 50 yards downstream. The dog sat, the signal for found something. Jake's heart rate kicked up. Old instincts. The roots were a tangle, and Jake could see where erosion had created a small cave beneath the bank. He knelt, pulling out his phone for light and peered into the darkness. At first he saw nothing but mud and roots and shadow. Then his light caught something white. Bone. Jake pulled back, breathing hard. He was seeing things. Had to be. Just an animal, a deer, or a dog that had crawled in there to die. But Ranger was whining now. That high-pitched sound he made when something was wrong, when danger was close. Jake forced himself to look again, to really look. The bone was small, delicate, human. A hand, skeletal and brown with age, reaching out from the mud as if trying to pull itself free. He'd found Sarah Brennan. Jake sat back on his heels, his mind racing. He should call the police. This was a crime scene, evidence that had been hidden for nearly 4 decades. But which police? Sheriff Clayton was long retired, but was his successor part of the same machinery that had buried the truth? Could Jake trust anyone in this town? He thought about his grandfather, about the threats that had silenced him, about Thomas Riley, Sarah's boyfriend, dead in a convenient accident 8 months after she disappeared, about his own father, somehow involved in a cover-up that reached the highest levels of local power. Ranger barked once, sharp and urgent. Jake turned to see a truck pulling into the parking area, an old Chevy Silverado, dark blue, with a sheriff's department decal on the door. His hand went again to his phantom sidearm. He was unarmed, alone, with a dead girl's skeleton and a box full of evidence that implicated people who might still have power. The truck door opened and a woman stepped out. She was in her 40s, wearing jeans and a department jacket, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She walked toward him with the careful posture of someone trained to assess threats, her hand resting casually near her service weapon. "Jake Mercer," she called out. "Depends on who's asking." She stopped about 15 feet away. "Detective Sarah Morris, County Sheriff's Department. Mrs. Henderson at the library called me. Said you were asking about an old case." "Morris," Jake said. "Any relation to Thomas Riley?" Her expression shifted. He was my uncle, my mother's brother. And before you ask, yes, I know his accident wasn't an accident. I've known that since I was old enough to understand what it meant. She moved closer, slowly, showing her badge. I've been waiting 20 years for someone to care about what happened to Sarah Brennan. I was named after her. Did you know that? My mother was her best friend. When Sarah disappeared, it broke something in my mom. When Tommy died, it broke something else. She drank herself to death by the time I was 12. Jake studied her. She had honest eyes, the kind that had seen darkness and chosen to fight it anyway. He made a decision. I found her, he said simply, pointing to the willow tree. Sarah. She's been here the whole time. Detective Morris closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them, there were tears, but her voice was steady. Show me. They stood together at the creek bank, two people carrying ghosts, looking down at bones that represented more than just a girl who died too young. They represented a town's shame, a conspiracy of silence, a failure of justice that had echoed through generations. I need to call this in, Morris said. But first, you need to know something. The people who did this, who covered it up, some of them are still around, still have power, still have friends. This won't be easy. Nothing worth doing is, Jake said. It was something his grandfather used to say. There's more, Morris continued. Earl Brennan is still alive, and he still insists his daughter ran away. He's never wavered from that story, not once in 39 years. Either he's the greatest liar who ever lived, or someone convinced him to believe it, Jake finished. Made him think it was true, or made it so he had no choice but to say it was true. Morris nodded. Your grandfather's journal. Mrs. Henderson mentioned it. You still have it? In my truck, along with a box of evidence that someone tried to hide for 4 decades. Then we do this right, Morris said. By the book. We call it in, we document everything, and we don't let anyone bury this again. You with me? Jake looked at Ranger, who sat patiently, waiting for the next command. He thought about his grandfather, carrying the weight of this secret to his grave. About Thomas Riley, a young man who'd probably died because he knew too much. About his own father, whose role in all this he still didn't understand. I'm with you, he said. The investigation exploded across Ashford like a tornado touching down on Main Street. Within 24 hours, the state police had taken over. The FBI had sent a team specializing in cold cases, and the town was crawling with reporters from Kansas City, St. Louis, and even CNN. Sarah Brennan's remains were carefully excavated from beneath the willow tree. The medical examiner confirmed what everyone already knew. She'd been murdered, probably on the night she disappeared. Blunt force trauma to the skull. She'd been buried in a shallow grave that had been washed out over the years by the creek's erosion, until her bones had become tangled in the willow's roots. Jake sat in a conference room at the state police headquarters, going through his grandfather's journal and the box of evidence with Detective Morris and an FBI agent named Patricia Chen. Outside, he could see news vans setting up, satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like mechanical flowers. Your grandfather was thorough, Agent Chen said, making notes on a tablet. He documented everything: conversations, observations, physical evidence. If he'd been able to bring this to the right people back in 1985, we might have solved this decades ago. He tried, Jake said. They threatened me, threatened a 6-year-old kid to keep him quiet. We know, Morris said, quietly. We've been going through Sheriff Clayton's old files. There's a lot missing, a lot that was clearly removed or destroyed. But there's enough to show he intentionally sabotaged the investigation. Is he still alive? Jake asked. Barely. He's in a nursing home, has dementia. Probably won't stand trial even if we wanted to charge him. She paused. But there are others. Agent Chen pulled up a photograph on her tablet. Recognize this man? Jake looked at the image. An old man, probably in his 70s, with hard eyes and a face that suggested he'd spent his life outdoors. Something about him was familiar. That's Earl Brennan, Chen said. Sarah's father. We brought him in for questioning this morning. He's refused to say anything without his lawyer. After 39 years of insisting she ran away, now he lawyers up, Jake said. Gets better, Morris interjected. Guess who his lawyer is? Douglas Clayton, the former sheriff's son. They've been friends for decades. Jake felt the pieces sliding into place. This wasn't just a cover-up. This was a network, a system of protection that ran through the town's power structure like roots through soil. We found something else in your grandfather's evidence, Chen said. The locket. We had it tested. The blood on it is Sarah's, confirmed through DNA comparison with Earl Brennan. But there was other DNA too. Skin cells, probably from whoever handled it after she died. We're running it through the databases, now. How long? Jake asked. Could be hours, could be days. Depends on whether the person is in the system. They worked through the afternoon, building a timeline, connecting dots that had been deliberately scattered. Thomas Riley had been Sarah's boyfriend. That much was clear from witness statements Mrs. Henderson had collected. He'd told friends he knew what happened to her, that he was going to the state police. 2 weeks later, his car had gone off Route 44 at high speed, hit a tree, and burned. The investigation had ruled it an accident, mechanical failure probably in the steering. My uncle was a mechanic, Morris said, her voice tight with old anger. He could fix anything. His car didn't just happen to fail. By evening, the DNA results came back. Agent Chen's expression when she walked back into the conference room told Jake everything. We got a hit, she said. Partial match. The DNA from the locket belongs to a relative of someone in the database, a retired deputy, named Frank Mercer. The room went silent. Jake felt like he'd been punched in the gut. That's my father, he whispered. We know, Chen said gently. We pulled his file. He was Sheriff Clayton's right-hand man in 1985. He was one of the first responders when Sarah was reported missing. Jake stood up, needing to move, needing air. Are you saying my father killed her? No, Morris said quickly. The DNA is consistent with someone who handled the locket after death, but it doesn't prove he killed her. He could have been at the scene, could have helped move the body or cover up the crime. But the actual killer? We still don't know. But he was involved, Jake said. It wasn't a question. Agent Chen nodded. It looks that way. I'm sorry. Jake walked out of the conference room, down the hall, out into the parking lot where Ranger was waiting in his truck. The dog greeted him with uncomplicated joy, and Jake buried his face in the animal's fur, letting the grief wash over him. His father. The man he'd spent his whole life trying to understand, trying to forgive for the drinking and the anger and the distance. The man who died alone because he'd pushed everyone away. And now Jake knew why. He'd been carrying a secret that had poisoned him from the inside, had turned him into someone who couldn't look his own son in the eye. Detective Morris found him there 20 minutes later. She didn't say anything, just sat on the tailgate of his truck. Two people who'd lost more than they should have, connected by a crime that had reached across decades to grab them both. My mother used to tell me stories about Sarah, Morris finally said. How she wanted to be a teacher, how she loved reading poetry, how she was planning to go to college even though her father forbade it. She had this whole life ahead of her, and someone took it because... Why? Because she wanted to be free? People kill for less, Jake said. His voice sounded dead even to his own ears. In Afghanistan, I saw people die for nothing, for being in the wrong place, for believing the wrong thing, for just existing. At least there, we knew who the enemy was. Here? He gestured at the small town spread out below them. The enemy wears a friendly face, sits next to you in church, shakes your hand at the grocery store. We're going to get them, Morris said. All of them. Everyone who was involved, everyone who covered it up, everyone who let a 16-year-old girl's death go unanswered for 39 years. Even if one of them was my father? Especially then, she said quietly, because that's what justice means. It means not looking away, even when it hurts. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Earl Brennan, after 2 days of silence, asked to speak to Jake. No lawyers, no police, just the two of them. This is highly irregular, Agent Chen said. He's a person of interest in a murder investigation. Let me talk to him, Jake said. Please. Whatever he has. To say he wants to say it to me. Maybe because of my grandfather, maybe because of my father. I don't know, but we might not get another chance. They set it up in a neutral location, a small office at the county courthouse, with Morris and Chen watching through a one-way mirror. Earl Brennan shuffled in, 82 years old and looking like he was made of dried leather and regret. He sat across from Jake, those hard eyes studying him. You look like your grandfather, he said finally. His voice was rough, unused to kindness. Thank you, Jake said. It wasn't a compliment. George Mercer was a stubborn son of a bitch who wouldn't leave well enough alone. Brennan paused, but he was right, about everything. Jake waited. This was the old man's show. I didn't kill my daughter, Brennan said, but I know who did. I've always known. Who? Your father, Frank Mercer. The words hit Jake like shrapnel. He'd prepared himself for this possibility, but hearing it said out loud was different. Tell me, Jake said. Brennan looked down at his weathered hands. Sarah was seeing someone, a boy from town, Tommy Riley. I didn't approve. Didn't approve of her wanting to go to college. Didn't approve of her having ideas above her station. I was hard on her. Too hard. I see that now. He took a shaky breath. The night she disappeared, we had a fight. She said she was leaving, going to Kansas City with Tommy, that I couldn't stop her. I told her over my dead body. She ran off, crying. I figured she'd cool down, come home when she got hungry. But she didn't. No, because she ran into Frank Mercer at the fairgrounds. He was working security that night, uniform and everything. He'd been drinking, which he did a lot back then. Sarah must have asked him for help, or maybe he offered her a ride. I don't know exactly what happened, but I know this. Frank Mercer had been obsessed with Sarah for months, watching her, following her. Your grandfather knew it too. He tried to warn me, but I didn't want to hear it. Jake felt sick. How do you know? Because Sheriff Clayton told me, came to my house 2 days after Sarah disappeared and laid it out. Said Frank had come to him that night, panicking, saying there'd been an accident. Said Sarah had gotten upset, tried to get out of his truck while it was moving, hit her head. Clayton said it wasn't murder, just a terrible accident. But if it came out, Frank would go to prison. They'd both lose everything. And you agreed to stay quiet? Jake's voice was harsh. They gave me a choice, Brennan said, his eyes finally meeting Jake's. Help them cover it up, say Sarah ran away, or they'd make sure the truth came out different. They'd say Sarah and Tommy were running drugs, that Tommy killed her in a fight over money, that I was involved. Clayton had friends everywhere, state police, judges, prosecutors. He could make any story true. And Tommy knew too much. He'd seen Frank's truck at the fairgrounds. He was asking questions. So they killed him too. Made it look like an accident. After that, I knew. I knew if I ever said anything, if I ever told the truth, they'd come for me next. So I lived with it, lived with the lie, buried my daughter without a body and pretended she was out there somewhere, living a life I hadn't wanted for her. It was easier than admitting I'd let her killers go free to save my own skin. The old man was crying now, silent tears running down his face. I've been in hell for 39 years, son. Every day, knowing she's dead, knowing where she probably is, and not being able to say anything. When George Mercer stopped asking questions, I thought it meant they'd gotten to him too. I hoped maybe someday he'd come forward, but he never did. They threatened me. Jake said quietly. When I was 6. That's why he stopped. Brennan nodded slowly. Then he was a better man than me. He gave up justice to protect you. I gave up my daughter to protect myself. Why tell me now? Because I'm dying. Cancer, got maybe 3 months. And I'm tired, so goddamn tired of carrying this. Your grandfather kept evidence. I saw him once, digging in his barn, thought he was crazy. But maybe he was smarter than all of us. Maybe he knew someday someone would come looking. Will you testify to this? Officially? Everything I just told you, I'll swear to in court. I'll name names. Clayton, your father, the deputy who helped move the body, the medical examiner who didn't ask questions, all of them. He leaned forward. I can't bring Sarah back, can't undo what I let happen, but I can make sure everyone knows the truth before I die. Jake stood. Thank you. Don't thank me, Brennan said bitterly. I should have done this 39 years ago. Should have been brave enough to face the consequences. Your grandfather was right about everything, including me. The trial took 8 months to prepare. Sheriff Clayton died before he could be charged, his dementia shielding him from earthly justice. But his son, the lawyer, was disbarred and charged with obstruction. 2 other retired deputies were arrested. The former medical examiner lost his license. Frank Mercer couldn't be tried, but his name was cleared in one sense and destroyed in another. The evidence showed he'd handled the locket, had been at the scene, but Earl Brennan's testimony also revealed that Frank had called Clayton in a panic, suggesting he hadn't intended to kill Sarah, manslaughter, not murder. But he'd made the choice to cover it up, and that choice had poisoned everything that came after. Jake stood at his grandfather's grave on a cold March morning, Ranger sitting quietly beside him. He'd finally read all of the journal, including the pages his grandfather had written but never included in the evidence box. Personal pages about shame and failure, about the cost of silence, about hoping his grandson would one day understand. I understand, Grandpa. Jake said to the stone marker. You did what you had to do to keep me safe, and you left me a map to find the truth when it was finally safe to look. Sarah Brennan was buried properly, in a ceremony attended by the whole town. Morris gave the eulogy, speaking about the girl her mother had loved, about dreams deferred and justice delayed. Earl Brennan was there, shrunken and gray, weeping openly. He died 6 weeks later, his testimony sealed in court records, his final act a confession that had come too late. Jake decided to keep the farm. He couldn't rebuild the barn, but he planted trees where it had stood, a small grove of willows as a memorial. He worked the land with Ranger by his side, finding peace in the simple rhythm of seasons, of growth and harvest, of things ending and beginning. Detective Morris became Sheriff Morris after a special election. She ran on a platform of transparency and accountability and won in a landslide. She stopped by the farm sometimes and they'd sit on the porch. 2 people who'd been broken by the truth and somehow put themselves back together. Your grandfather would be proud, she told him once. You finished what he started. We finished it, Jake corrected. You, me, Earl Brennan in the end. Even Mrs. Henderson with her folder of clippings. Even Sarah herself leaving that locket where someone could find it someday. Morris nodded, looking out over the land. You know what the strangest part is? Coming home almost destroyed you. The memories, the past, your father's involvement. But it also saved you. Jake thought about that, about the nightmares that had started to fade, not because the war went away, but because he'd found something worth fighting for that didn't involve a gun. About the therapy sessions that finally started working when he could talk about real problems, present ones, instead of just circling old trauma. About waking up each morning with purpose, even if that purpose was just feeding chickens and fixing fence posts. Ranger saved me, he said, scratching the dog's ears. Everything else was just details. Dogs are good at that, Morris said. Seeing what we need before we know we need it. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set over the Missouri hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. In town, life went on. The scandal had rocked Ashford to its foundations, but small towns were resilient. They absorbed the shock, adjusted their stories, found new equilibrium. The diner still served the best pie in the county. The high school football team still played on Friday nights. Kids still dreamed of escape, and some of them still came back. Jake had been one of those kids. He'd run as fast and far as he could, joined the army to prove something to himself and his father, fought in wars that had no clear endings. And in the end, the thing he'd been running from was also the thing that saved him. Home, with all its complications and secrets and pain. Among the ashes of the old barn, he and his dog had found more than just a box. They'd found a purpose, a mission that mattered. They'd found justice for a girl who'd been forgotten, truth for a grandfather who'd been silenced, and redemption for a broken veteran who'd thought there was nothing left to fight for. The willows Jake had planted were already growing, their roots reaching down into the same soil where his great-great-grandfather had first broken ground in 1889. In 30 years, maybe 40, they'd be, as tall as the old barn had been, a living memorial to Sarah Brennan and to everyone who'd been hurt by the silence. As darkness fell, Jake and Ranger walked back to the farmhouse. There was work to do tomorrow. There was always work to do. But tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Jake Mercer slept without pills, without nightmares, without the weight of secrets that weren't his, but had become his responsibility. Among the ashes, they'd found truth. And truth, it turned out, was the only thing that could make the fire stop burning.